G'day, welcome to Avoiding Goodhart's Law, using SLOs as tools, not cudgels. The concepts of SLI, SLO and error budget are there to balance risk and reward, risk around the acceptable rate of change and reward being the business success and customer contentment. Using such metrics to punish teams for exceeding budgets or forcing acceptance of change within the business is a path to failure. This session is going to give you a few hints for success. And I'd like to thank my hosts at DevOps Enterprise Summit for giving me the chance to share some knowledge in this way. First, let me introduce myself. G'day, I'm Marco. I am an ex-CTO who has worked for one of the top 50 international banks. I've supported data centers for hospitals and service providers and worked for some of the industry's largest vendors. I've lived in 3 countries and managed teams across 13 countries. I also spent 5 years as an industry analyst running the data science team at 451 Research. Seeing technology from every side as an operator, developer, analyst, vendor, buyer, and CTO gives me a unique view on technology. You can read some of my writing or interviews in the publications on the left here or at my own personal website, tech-whisperer.com. So enough about me. It's good to have targets, right? Think of Robin Hood, the story where he places a child against a tree, and he loads up his arrow and he aims, and then we're told of an apple as a target on the child's head. Well, with that, the story becomes a story of a skilled archer. But without that target apple, well, it's just the story of a dangerous guy who's shooting arrows at children. So it's good to have targets as long as you use them correctly. Now, today's session is going to come in 3 chapters. I will talk about how I experienced Goodhart's Law before I even knew it existed. Then we will think about the SLIs in a better way across dimensions. And finally, I will throw a few hints about negotiating your SLAs and give you some further reading. So let's get going. I'll get to Goodhart's Law in a moment. I want to share an experience with you first. Now, depending on your personality, you will either pause, relax, and enjoy my story, or you might be already searching online for Goodhart on Wikipedia. And that's gaming the system. Now, some folks define the gaming the system as a smart play. Others equate the phrase to cheating. I guess I'm more in the second group. For me, gaming the system means taking the rules that are created to protect a system and instead manipulating the system towards a desired outcome or goal. Here's an example. In a prior life, back in Australia, I worked for a service provider that supported all of the hospitals in a state. Now, in hospitals, nurses take lab samples and they get sent to the labs. They are processed and the results get transmitted back to the patient record where the nurse back in the ward can immediately look them up. Pretty simple, right? By the way, the wards are often on the 16th floor somewhere, while the labs are in the basement of another building on campus. It can be quite some distance between them. Now, technically, it looked a little like this. Messages from the lab's Unix system would be sent to message queues, and the queues then fed the lab updates into the mainframe system that held all the patient records. Now, everything allegedly spoke a common HL7 standard, so there's never going to be any problems, right? Some of you already see where this is going. Different vendors had slightly different interpretations of the HL7 standard, and malformed messages would get stuck in the queue. We would get phone calls from hospitals that they had to go to manual procedures. Now, the backup procedure, if the message queues get stuck or if the data doesn't appear in the patient record, was for the nurses to physically run from the ward down to the labs to get results. This was not optimal as the patient's health was at risk both from the delay and from the nurse being absent from the ward. Now, being techies, we thought we would take care of the situation by setting an SLA that said if the message queues get higher than 100, we, the service provider, had to refund money back. That sort of addressed things, right? I even coded a monitor bash script so that when the queue length approached, it didn't have any internal monitors, so when the queue length approached 100, alerts would start to go off. Monitor icons would turn from green to yellow to red. Now, as technicians, we focused on that measure as the target, as the goal. We even built capacity plans around making sure that that queue processing system got all the power it needed. Now, you might think, great result, Marco, that's top notch. The lab results are getting to the ward in time, right? Well, the only problem was we would still get those pesky phone calls from the nurses in the ward saying the system sucked. And nurses don't bite their tongue when they're telling you you're not helping them. They were always having to run down and manually collect results. And we looked, but the message queues were empty. Now, the problem was, well, now transactions were starting timing out before hitting the message queue. We were managing the capacity plan In fact, the whole application to the metric and not the outcome. Now, years later, I learned that this procedure had a name. And yes, we're finally going to get to Goodhart. Now, Goodhart was an economist in the UK who in 1975 stated, let me read this, any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Now, I know that's kind of wordy. He was English. He was a politician. Word is what you get. Here's what he meant. Basically, the law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure because people will game the system. Now, Q length was a good measure of Q function. We were managing to Q length as a target for success instead of successful laboratory transactions in patient records, which is what the nurses needed. So how do we avoid Goodhart's law? Well, we need to let SLIs be measures and SLOs be goals. So what should we measure? The key is to stand in the other people's shoes to see everything from a few different angles, so hence 3 dimensions. Remember, DevOps is about balancing the risk of unavailability against rapid innovation and efficient operation. We embrace that risk by giving it a value through well-defined and governed service level indicators, objectives, and agreements. As you're identifying SLIs, we need measures that see the whole picture in the 3 key dimensions of code, infrastructure, and customer experience. So let me step it through a simple example here based on that hospital environment. The example is not going to give you specific SLIs that you can apply in your environment. It's not meant to. It's intended to share the thought process. Now first, let's quickly review and agree the SLI, SLO, SLA model. Now SLIs are numbers.